For more than 3 decades, American Bandstand owned Saturday afternoons. It had survived Elvis, the Beatles, disco, and every cultural shift that tried to bury rock and roll. Dick Clark had built something that seemed absolutely bulletproof, a television institution that introduced America to everyone from Buddy Holly to Prince. But on August 1, 1981, something happened that would eventually destroy everything Clark had created, and most fans never saw it coming. At exactly midnight, a new cable channel called MTV launched with a single music video. The song was called "Video Killed the Radio Star," and the title turned out to be more prophetic than anyone realized. That performance, broadcast from a small cable network most people had never heard of, would eventually take American Bandstand off the air for good. But the real story behind how it happened is far more complicated than most people understand. Before we can understand how American Bandstand died, we need to go back to how it became untouchable in the first place. The show actually started in Philadelphia back in 1952, when local station WFIL decided to put teenagers dancing to records on television. It was a strange concept for the time, filling airtime with kids doing something they would have done anyway at home or at school dances. But Philadelphia teenagers showed up in massive numbers, lining up around the block just for a chance to appear on camera. The original host was a radio personality named Bob Horn, and for a few years, the local version of Bandstand became one of the highest-rated programs in the Philadelphia market. Then, in July 1956, Horn was arrested for drunk driving, and the station needed someone to replace him immediately. They turned to a young announcer named Dick Clark, who had been working behind the scenes as a substitute host and record spinner. Clark was only 26 years old, but he understood something about television that most people in the music business had not figured out yet. He knew that if parents were going to let their teenagers watch a show built around rock and roll, they needed to trust the man standing in front of the camera. So Clark turned himself into exactly what worried parents wanted to see. He dressed conservatively, spoke politely, enforced strict rules about clothing and behavior, and presented rock and roll as something clean, safe, and all-American. That image was not an accident. Clark knew that the music itself already frightened adults, so he made sure everything else about the show felt as respectable as possible. By August 1957, ABC decided to take Bandstand national, and the transformation was immediate. The show was renamed American Bandstand, and within just 2 days of the first broadcast, Dick Clark had become one of the most powerful figures in popular music. The format was deceptively simple. Teenagers danced to records while Clark introduced performers who lip-synced their latest hits. But what made the show so valuable was its reach. Before American Bandstand, a new artist had to tour city by city, convincing local radio stations to play their records and hoping the song would eventually catch fire. Now, a single appearance on Clark's show could reach 20 million homes in one afternoon. Record companies immediately understood what that kind of exposure was worth, and they desperately wanted their artists booked on the program. The show's influence went far beyond just playing records. American Bandstand actually shaped what became popular. When Chubby Checker appeared in 1960 to demonstrate a new dance called the twist, it triggered a nationwide phenomenon that eventually reached all the way to high society parties in New York. The dance became so massive that it crossed generational lines, something almost unheard of in the rock and roll era. Throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, American Bandstand continued introducing audiences to performers who would later define American music. Smokey Robinson and the Miracles appeared in 1966. The Doors performed in 1967. The Jackson 5 took the stage in 1970, with a young Michael Jackson giving his first television interview. 3 years later, the show celebrated its 20th anniversary with a lineup that included Little Richard, Johnny Mathis, and Three Dog Night. The 25th anniversary in 1977 brought together Chuck Berry, the Pointer Sisters, and dozens of other performers for what would become one of the show's most memorable episodes. But even as American Bandstand was celebrating these milestones, the television landscape was changing underneath it. By the late 1970s, the show had already moved from its original weekday afternoon schedule to Saturday afternoons, a clear sign that local stations were getting tired of giving up valuable airtime. The move hurt ratings immediately. Teenagers who had watched the show after school during the week were now outside on Saturday afternoons, not sitting in front of their televisions.
ABC tried to compensate by leaning heavily into whatever was popular at the moment. When disco exploded, the show featured a major disco special co-hosted by Donna Summer. When the Village People performed YMCA in 1979, Clark helped demonstrate the dance moves that would eventually become one of the most recognizable routines in pop culture. But these moments of relevance were becoming fewer and farther between. Then MTV arrived, and everything Dick Clark had built suddenly looked dangerously old-fashioned. The concept behind music television was not particularly complicated. Instead of showing teenagers dancing to records, MTV would broadcast the actual music videos that artists were creating to promote their songs. For viewers, especially younger audiences, the difference was massive. American Bandstand offered a few minutes of lip-synced performance surrounded by dancing teenagers and Clark's introductions. MTV offered an endless stream of visual creativity, with artists using the video format to create mini-movies, strange experimental films, and elaborate productions that turned songs into complete artistic statements. More importantly, MTV played music videos 24 hours a day. It did not matter if you missed a particular video at 3 p.m. because it would play again at 9 p.m. and probably twice more before the week ended. American Bandstand, meanwhile, was still limited to a single weekly broadcast on Saturday afternoons. The early days of MTV were chaotic and underfunded. The channel launched with only a few hundred music videos in its library, which meant the same clips appeared over and over again. The original video jockeys, or VJs as they were called, introduced videos with an informal, unpolished style that was completely different from Clark's carefully controlled presentation. But that rough, unpredictable energy turned out to be exactly what younger viewers wanted. MTV felt like it belonged to them in a way that American Bandstand never quite could. Clark's show had always been something teenagers watched with the knowledge that it was also designed to keep their parents comfortable. MTV did not care what parents thought. It was loud, strange, sometimes controversial, and unapologetically aimed at young audiences. The impact on American Bandstand was not immediate, but it was inevitable. Throughout the early 1980s, Clark kept booking major performers and tried to modernize the show's look and format. But he was fighting against a fundamental shift in how young people discovered and experienced music. Teenagers were no longer satisfied watching other teenagers dance to records when they could see Duran Duran performing on a yacht or Michael Jackson transforming into a werewolf. The music video had become the primary promotional tool for the industry, and American Bandstand's format suddenly felt like a relic from another era. By the mid-1980s, the show's ratings had collapsed. ABC affiliates across the country began dropping American Bandstand from their Saturday schedules, replacing it with college football coverage or local programming where they could keep all the advertising revenue. Clark was losing the same battle that had hurt the show back in 1963, but this time there was no easy solution. There is a certain irony in how American Bandstand actually ended. The show that had launched countless careers and introduced America to rock and roll, soul, disco, and new wave did not go out with a scandal or a controversy or even a memorable final performance. It simply faded away because the world had moved on. Dick Clark himself survived the end of American Bandstand without much difficulty. By the time the show left the air, he had already built a media empire that extended far beyond a single television program. Dick Clark Productions was creating awards shows, variety specials, and eventually the New Year's Rockin' Eve broadcast that would define his later career. Clark became more famous for counting down to midnight on December 31st than he ever was for introducing performers on Saturday afternoons. In a strange way, his greatest achievement was not American Bandstand itself but the fact that he had used the show as a launching pad for something much bigger. But the show's legacy remained complicated. American Bandstand had genuinely helped break down cultural barriers by bringing black musicians into millions of American homes at a time when much of the country was still segregated. Yet the show's own studio floor remained overwhelmingly white during its most influential years, a contradiction that Clark never fully addressed. The program had given national exposure to artists who might have otherwise remained regional successes, but Clark had also profited enormously from his business relationships with record companies, relationships that came dangerously close to the payola practices that destroyed other broadcasters' careers. And while American Bandstand had presented rock and roll as safe and respectable, it had also stripped away some of the music's rebellious energy, turning something dangerous into something parents could tolerate.
In December 2004, Clark suffered a serious stroke that left him with difficulty speaking. He made occasional appearances on his New Year's Eve broadcast, but the man who had spent decades as one of television's most polished performers was visibly struggling. On April 18, 2012, Dick Clark died from a heart attack following prostate surgery. He was 82 years old. The performance that took American Bandstand off the air was not really a performance at all. It was the first music video that MTV ever broadcast, a song about technology making the old guard obsolete. Video did not actually kill the radio star, but it definitely killed the television show that had introduced radio stars to America for more than 30 years. And somewhere in that shift, an entire era of American pop culture quietly disappeared.